50 years ago, this man cracked the code for generating free, renewable energy in his backyard with nothing more than a pile of sticks. His system generated scalding hot water for 18 months straight. It produced enough gas to run his kitchen for a year. It charged his batteries, powered lights, and put 60 miles of fuel in his van. And the only byproduct of the process was a fertilizer so potent that it allowed him to grow tropical fruit on soil so poor it was considered biologically dead. The system almost defied physics. Journalists flew from across the world to document it. Reader's Digest ran a feature, and his book sold more than 100,000 copies. An energy expert at the time even famously proclaimed that he had discovered the future of both fertilizer and energy production combined into a single, elegant loop. But then, the technology vanished. This is the story of the Biomeiler, the forgotten technology that turns a woodpile into a backyard power station, and why, 50 years later, almost nobody is using it. In 1964, Jean Pain and his wife, Ida, were entrusted with the management of a 590-acre forest in the Var region of southern France. This wasn't a lush paradise, it was a tinderbox. The French government, terrified of the summer fires that could wipe out entire villages, mandated that forest managers create fire breaks. Jean was suddenly buried under mountains of brushwood and undergrowth. To the government, this was a massive disposal problem that required expensive trucking and burning. To Jean, it looked like an untapped opportunity for self-sufficiency. His first experiment was modest. He used chipped wood as bedding for his goats, which eliminated the need for purchasing expensive straw. Not only did it save money, but the goats also appeared measurably healthier. And when he applied the used bedding to his vegetable garden, the results startled him. In dry, sandy dolomite soil, the kind where nothing grows, he grew watermelons, 7-foot tomato plants, and chayote, a tropical gourd from the West Indies. The plants even drew moisture directly from the compost itself, so he didn't have to water them. His garden was flourishing, but he also recognized another important observation that would go on to become his greatest legacy. He noticed that when he began piling chipped wood into large mounds and saturating them with water, his compost heaps generated a considerable amount of heat. A heat that was sustained, measurable, and extractable regardless of the season or the weather. What Jean had stumbled into was something that gardeners had understood at a surface level since the 17th century. 300 years ago, French market farmers built hotbeds of decomposing manure to grow vegetables through winter, and British gardeners used the same principle to cultivate pineapples a century later. But what Jean was about to do with this power was on a different scale entirely. He did not want to warm a seedling tray. He wanted to heat a house. And buried somewhere inside that rotting mound of wood chips was the exact mechanism that would let him do it. To understand what Jean built, you first need to understand what was happening inside that mound. When organic material such as wood chips, food waste, or manure is gathered into a pile and kept moist, microorganisms initiate aerobic decomposition. They break down the material, converting it into compost while releasing carbon dioxide, ammonium, and significant quantities of heat. 35 cubic feet of actively decomposing material can generate up to 2,500 kilocalories per day. To put that into context, that is enough energy to bring 8 gallons of water to a full boil, every single day. By the early 1970s, Jean had moved beyond rectangular test mounds. The structure he arrived at was circular, a shape that kept heat in while letting the composting reaction at the center run at full strength. Inside 40 tons of densely packed, water-saturated wood chips, he coiled 650 feet of polyethylene piping in a continuous loop. Cold groundwater was pumped into one end of that pipe, and by the time it emerged from the other end, it had reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The system produced this at a rate of 1 gallon per minute, continuously, for 18 months. That output was sufficient to heat their 1,000 square foot home and supply hot water from the tap around the clock, across every season, without any external energy source. But Jean wasn't done. Not even close. Buried inside the mound was a sealed steel tank of 140 cubic feet, packed with a slurry of finer wood waste. As the material inside decomposed anaerobically, it released methane gas, which Jean captured in a series of truck inner tubes arranged beside the mound. Within 90 days, the tank produced nearly 1,800 cubic feet of gas, enough fuel to run their kitchen stove and oven for an entire year. The remaining gas powered a generator. The output was modest, around 100 watts, but sufficient to charge a battery bank and light their 5-bedroom home. Jean then compressed surplus gas into 2 cylinders, mounted on the roof of his Citroën van, giving him 60 miles of vehicle range. But the final payoff happened when the heat finally stopped 18 months later. When Jean dismantled his heaps, he wasn't left with ash or trash. He was left with humus, a concentrated, nutrient-dense fertilizer that was biologically superior to anything sold in a garden center. He used this black gold to grow 1,000 square meters of vegetables in the mountains without ever using a drop of chemical fertilizer or even irrigation. The humus was so rich in organic matter that it held onto every drop of mountain mist, feeding his plants through the harsh Mediterranean summers. He had created a system where the output of one process was the perfect input for the next. Payne had spent 15 years building something the world genuinely needed. He had developed and publicized the Biomeiler during the oil crisis of the 1970s, a period when governments and research institutions were genuinely searching for alternatives to fossil fuels. But by the early 1980s, oil prices had stabilized, the political urgency had dissipated, and the economic incentive to fund energy systems that nobody could own or control had evaporated almost overnight. The Biomeiler was buried by the convenience of the fossil fuel era. We became a society of consumers rather than producers, trading our independence for the flick of a thermostat switch. But the very problems Jean was trying to solve in the 70s never went away. In 2024, the average European household spent over €2,000 annually on energy. In the United Kingdom, the energy price cap had risen more than 300% compared to pre-crisis levels. In the United States, residential energy costs increased by over 30% between 2019 and 2023, with forecasts projecting continued rises through the decade. Meanwhile, fertilizer prices reached historic highs following supply chain disruptions and the conflict in Ukraine, with global nitrogen fertilizer costs rising over 200% between 2020 and 2022, before partially recovering. For anyone managing land, growing food, or simply heating a home, the conditions in the 21st century look almost identical to the ones that made Jean Payne's work feel urgent in the 1970s. With all the promise the Biomeiler shows, it makes you wonder, why isn't everyone building one? Well, for starters, building a functional Biomeiler requires land, not a backyard and not a suburban garden. Jean's system consumed 40 tons of wood chips, and sourcing that volume of material requires access to a forest. The construction itself is also physical work. Chipping wood, hauling material, laying pipe, saturating the mound, monitoring moisture levels. Jean did this with his wife as part of their lifestyle. It is not a weekend project, and it is also not a project that rewards impatience. The system then requires patience, as the microbial population needs time to establish, and the internal temperature rises gradually over the first several weeks before stabilizing. Anyone expecting instant results will abandon the system long before it proves itself. And for those in urban or suburban environments, the realistic application of Jean Payne's principles is simply unrealistic. It's easy to see why governments or companies don't push these kinds of solutions either. Unlike solar, wind, or geothermal, there's no billion-dollar industry to back here, no corporate benefits or money to be made, just one guy in the woods, making fuel from rotting sticks. The Biomeiler never made it as a mainstream energy solution, but Jean Payne's work did not vanish entirely. It went underground, in the way that unpatentable knowledge tends to, carried forward by practitioners who valued function over recognition. In rural France and Germany, a small number of forest managers continued applying his composting principles to soil remediation through the 1980s and 90s. In permaculture communities across Europe, North America, and Australia, the Biomeiler became a reference point for integrated land systems design, appearing in course curricula and practitioner manuals. Galen Brown's 2014 book, The Compost-Powered Water Heater, also helped introduce the technology to a new generation of homesteaders and off-grid builders. And slowly, interest has intensified measurably. We are seeing the Biomeiler integrate with even more advanced low-tech solutions. Imagine a Biomeiler connected to a Stirling engine, a device that converts a temperature difference into mechanical motion. We have the technology to not just extract heat and gas, but also actual electricity from the decay of a woodpile. The research into micro-CHP systems is pointing back toward the very principles Jean Payne was shouting about in the 70s. Today, we are also seeing a shift in how we view waste streams in our cities. There are now projects looking at how to use the massive amounts of used coffee grounds produced by our metropolitan areas to fuel urban biomeilers. Coffee grounds are high in nitrogen and energy, making them an ideal turbocharge for a wood chip reactor. When we look at the research reports coming out of the Global Eco-Village Network and industrial experiments today, we see that the Biomeiler is being reinvented for a new era. It's being called biological oxidation, and it's being tested with everything from coffee grounds to municipal waste. But here's the part that should make you genuinely angry. We currently live in a world where we pay tipping fees to get rid of wood waste. We spend millions of taxpayer dollars to clear brush from highways to prevent fires, and then we pay again to bury that brush in a landfill where it rots and produces harmful greenhouse gases. The Biomeiler turns that entire broken system on its head. It turns a liability, the fuel for wildfires, into an asset that provides home heating and food security. If you are a small farmer or a landowner, you are likely sitting on a goldmine of energy that you are currently paying someone else to haul away. The research proves that a standard pile, roughly 5 meters in diameter, can produce enough heat to sustain a 1,500 square foot home through a brutal winter. At current utility rates, that pile isn't just wood. It's a 4-figure check written to your bank account every single year. But there is a technical secret that many people get wrong when they try to replicate Jean's work. The research shows that the most critical variable is particle size. If your wood chips are too large, the surface area isn't big enough for the bacteria to thrive. If they are too small, the pile packs down so tightly that oxygen can't get in, the aerobic bacteria die, and the whole thing begins to smell like a swamp. Jean found the Goldilocks zone, the perfect chip size that allowed the pile to breathe while maintaining enough density to trap the heat. The question Jean Payne never got to fully answer, because the oil crisis ended before the world had to take him seriously, is whether the conditions that make his system most valuable will finally be the ones that make it most used. Jean passed away in 1981, just as the world was doubling down on the era of consumption. He didn't live to see the internet, where his blueprints are now downloaded by thousands of people every month. He didn't live to see the right to repair movement or the surge in off-grid living. But his legacy is more alive today than it was during his Reader's Digest feature in 1981. We are the generation that has to solve the energy puzzle, and we have to do it without the luxury of infinite cheap oil. The Biomeiler represents something genuinely rare in the world of renewable energy. A proven, complete system, built from materials that cannot be priced out of reach, that produces heat, fuel, and soil fertility simultaneously. A lot of the information I used to make this video came from Jean's book. It's full of practical, brilliant ideas about compost, forest management, and building an off-grid life. I've linked it below if you want to have a look. And if you enjoyed this video, then it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like, subscribe, and share this with someone you think could benefit from learning about the Biomeiler. We're just getting started on our journey into exploring the world of low-tech solutions, and I'd be thrilled if you'd join us on this adventure.